Bomb, 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 dang, 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 ding, ding, dong, ding, boom. Bomb, 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 dang, 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 ding, dong, ding, boom. Boom, boom, boom. Bomb, 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 dang, 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 ding, dong, ding, blue moon.
All right, that was so much fun. I love Alison. Great choice in music today. Well, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us on this Wednesday at lunch for another webinar on gardening. So today our class is going to be gardening myths and old wives' tales and debunking the truth with science. Yes, I said that correctly. Great. So today you guys are in for a treat. Alison O'Connor is with us again from CSU Extension in Larimer County. And Alison has been with Extension for about 16 years now, super knowledgeable about so many different areas of horticulture. And so this should be a pretty fun class for her. So thanks, Alison, for joining.
So the first thing is, do you believe everything you read? Do you believe everything you hear? There's a lot of information being thrown at us every day from many different sources, whether it's via social media or the news. And so there's so much to try to digest in our society. And when we get to gardening stuff, it becomes even more complicated because there's so many different people, organizations, universities, research giving us information. So I loved this slide, and I thought it really set us up for a funny moment because you can really correlate anything. So you can correlate how much cheese you eat to your likelihood of becoming tangled in your bed sheets and succumbing to your own demise. So you can, again, correlate everything. So when you see things like this, what I'm encouraging you to do today is to really think about, does this make sense? And is this applicable to our area? So some other headlines. I love The Onion. If I'm looking for a good laugh, I always go to The Onion because they are so clever and so witty. And so I find some of these headlines just to be hilarious. And so obviously something like this are really to get you to laugh, to really lighten the mood, to get a moment. But then there are other headlines that we might come across that give you a little bit more pause, or things that you might believe because it's from a credible source. And so again, this is not to judge you on where you get your information. It's just to have you think about how much information is being thrown at us every day and how you can separate fact from fiction, because there's a lot of myths in the world. And of course, I'm focusing on the horticulture myths, but there's a lot that you can do. Dieting, exercise, all of those things are filled in our society, especially this time of year, right after the holidays. So according to George Washington, if it's on the internet, then it must be true. And hopefully you're thinking, well, gosh, George was way ahead of his time when he was our first president way back when. But as we know, if it is on the internet, it doesn't always mean that it's true. So keep that in mind going forward. And myths are everywhere in our culture, in our society. And essentially what a myth is, the definition of a myth is a widely held but false belief or idea. And so to me, some myths are completely harmless, like going over to Oregon and looking for Sasquatch. Wouldn't that be fun to actually see him? And actually some of the photos you see look very, very real. Or if you end up in Scotland and you look for Nessie, the Loch Ness Monster, another harmless myth. But when it comes to gardening, especially, sometimes myths can be dangerous and they can actually lead harm to us or to our plants. And a myth that we try to work with in Extension is this belief that if you apply a little, it could be fertilizer, it could be an herbicide. If you apply a little, then if you double that amount, it could be so much better. And obviously, we're not talking about reading the label and following directions and things like that, but we know that we can cause some harm to plants or even to our own health if we misapply a product. So that is the premise for today. And popular information isn't bad or wrong. I am not here to say that. I am a fan of all sorts of culture and where we get our information from. It's just when it comes to gardening, what I would inform you is that Colorado is unique. A lot of people have moved here. I'm a transplant from the Midwest. And what I learned in my both undergraduate and graduate degrees, a lot of it didn't even apply to Colorado. And Amy moved here from Kentucky a little bit more recently than I did, and I bet she would say the same thing. So Colorado is unique. She's nodding. And some of those tips and tricks that you either grew up with or that your mom or your grandma or your dad or whoever was your gardening influence in your life, they may not work here in Colorado. So I hate to bust it, but as much as you want to grow blueberries or even azaleas or some of those plants, it is going to be darn near impossible to keep those plants happy. So that's the thing, is that you can't always grow maybe what you want, but we are able to grow a lot of things. And I would encourage you to use resources like CSU Extension. We're your outreach arm. We're the people who can help you muddle through some of that information if you don't necessarily understand. We have a cadre of master gardeners, many who are on today, who can also help you. So reach out to your local extension office and ask them your questions. What tree is best? How do I amend my soil properly so that you can get the good information and have success in the garden? What we'll discuss today are these 7 myths. I actually started with 10, and then I realized that was just way too much. So I whittled it down to 7, and we're going to actually start off with a really fun one, because there was a rumor on Facebook. We can blame Facebook, we can blame Twitter, we can blame Instagram, it doesn't matter. There was a post made on social media for a while that vegetables have a gender, and that eggplants, peppers, and some others, actually there were male and female fruit that you could buy, and you were supposed to go to the grocery store and sort your way through the bin to find a male one or a female one, depending on your uses. So do vegetables have a gender? Let's kick it off with this one. No, vegetables do not have a gender, okay? Especially some of our bearing fruit plants. This is a facepalm moment for us horticulturalists. So the basis for the myth, and I'll start off every myth with the basis. I don't know where this one started. I have no idea how rumors like this began, but someone posted it, someone shared it, and then all of a sudden it becomes ingrained in our popular culture. So it was on a blog, Facebook, somewhere, and those claims said that eggplants, we're talking eggplants specifically, have belly buttons. Boy eggplants have belly buttons, and girl eggplants have long slits at the base. And the claim was that if you find the boy eggplants with a belly button, you'll have less seeds. And you don't want seeds in your eggplant because seeds are bitter. So when you're making your eggplant parm or your baba ganoush or whatever it is, you want those boy eggplants because they have less seeds, which will then not affect the flavor of your plants. So this is what it looks like in real life. So on the left, we have the girl eggplant with the slit on the bottom, and on the right, we have the boy with his little belly button. And, yes, there are differences among fruit. Every fruit looks different because nature is beautiful in that way. And no two fruits are ever the same. But someone came up with this idea that there's boy and girl eggplants. So subject matter experts, these are the people who backed the myth that supported it, said female eggplants have more seeds. Seeds are bitter on purpose so as not to attract seed eaters. The fruit doesn't want to get eaten. I mean, life is hard enough for females without having to worry about a predator wanting you for your seeds, right? Subject matter expert. Another one said, if you fish around in the bin comparing different belly buttons, you'll make it easier to have a final decision. So I can just envision these poor people who are at the grocery store or your Instacart shoppers or whomever you use to do grocery shopping. And in the notes you say, I only want the eggplants with a belly button. And then they have to fish around in the bin. It's kind of like avocado season where you're trying to find the ripe ones so you can have guacamole that night. It's actually really funny. Additional people said, I assumed it was legitimate since I learned it from a food professional in the fresh markets. So some of our own professionals might be leading us astray. And Paula was thrilled because she found the male eggplant for her eggplant parm, and it made her career, or her life, or her dinner at least. So there's a lot of this out there, and it is very interesting. So again, huge sigh, face palm, all of the emotions right there. Do eggplants have a gender? They do not. Eggplants do not have a gender. Botanically speaking, eggplants are complete flowers, which means they have both male and female parts together in the same flower. Now, it is true that we have plants that are sometimes male and sometimes female. Absolutely true. But in this case, eggplants, male and female parts. So we have the male pollen, which then fertilizes the eggs, and then voila, we get an eggplant fruit, which is amazing. So eggplants and peppers, for that matter, do not have a gender. So do not perpetuate this myth. It's not a good idea. And back to that belly button, it's the tip of the ovary. So when we look botanically at our fruit that's produced, the belly button is just where the ovary was forming, and the bottom of plants are going to vary because nature happens. So depending on how they were grown, maybe there was some drought stress. There's so many different factors. Variety is one of what the bottom of the fruit looks like. But guaranteed, when you buy an eggplant, you are getting all the parts, and you're also going to get seed regardless. And the seed doesn't affect the taste. So nature happens. There are not boy and girl eggplants. And next time this summer, when your fruit are producing, you can get a good look at this. So cut open an apple and take a peek at all of those plant parts. So boy eggplants versus girl eggplants does not exist. So this myth is indeed busted. So we will move on from eggplants to something else. Right, the next one is bug zappers. And do they really reduce insect populations? The neighbor behind me, his name is Mike, he's a very nice man. He does have a bug zapper. And so when you're outside, you hear these little zaps, and of course know that those poor little bugs have met their demise and are now smoking at the bottom of the bug zapper. But do they actually work? Do they do anything to reduce our insect populations in our gardens? The basis of the myth is that insects are a nuisance. They can be harmful to our health. And in the case of mosquitoes, this is absolutely 100% true. I have nothing good to say about mosquitoes. They are the worst insect because they cause some of the most horrible diseases worldwide. So in that case, yes, insects can be a nuisance, but we have lots of good guys too. So many good guys out there. And another basis is that using bug zappers is environmentally friendly, it's chemical free, and it's a way to reduce some of those bug populations. And it's a fairly small investment so that you can enjoy time on the patio outside. So here's the truth behind bug zappers. So true bug zappers are largely ineffective. And when we talk about insects that are the troublesome ones, usually the first at the top of the list is either yellow jackets or mosquitoes, both of which are not attracted to bug zappers in the least. So the bug zappers really don't work at all at controlling mosquito populations, especially female mosquitoes, which are the biting ones. The females need blood in order to not only nourish their eggs, but then give birth to more mosquitoes. And so the female mosquitoes are the ones we worry about. The males, not so much. Black light traps, so sometimes our bug zappers are equipped with a black light, have been found to be actually detrimental to beneficial insects. So some of our native pollinators and other good guys, moths, all of those have actually been found to be more likely to be killed with the bug zappers that have the black lights. And black lights are still really bad at controlling mosquitoes. So this was a cool study done back in 1996. I know we're throwing it back a number of years, but it was really interesting. So Timothy Frick and Douglas Tallamy, you might know Doug Tallamy because he really is kind of an amazing entomologist. They published a study in Entomological News, and what they did is they put out bug zappers, and then they actually counted and evaluated the bugs that were killed that summer with the bug zappers that they had. So they counted nearly 14,000 insects, and by them, I'm sure it was some unsuspecting graduate student who was tasked this. But of the 14,000 insects trapped, only 31 were biting flies, which can be a nuisance. So think of those no-see-ums or some of those gnats. So, 0.2% of all the insects were biting flies. That also included our female mosquitoes. So that's a lot of dead bugs to wade through in order to find 31 that were actually killed by the bug zapper. And the bigger problem is that just over 60%, just under 65%, were non-biting and harmless and predators and parasites. So the good guys, again, 65% of those bugs were good guys that were zapped by this bug zapper that is supposed to do good things. So again, it's just unfortunate. So the ones you want to go after, the mosquitoes and biting flies and things like that, were not the ones attracted to these bug zappers. So really, obviously, you can see where we're going with this one, that it doesn't work. So in short, bug zappers are worthless. They're potentially detrimental to the environment and beneficial insects. So if you are trying to encourage beneficial insects and native pollinators and all of that, do not use bug zappers. It's not a good thing. And the Delaware researchers took it a step further and extrapolated that 4 million bug zappers, that's what was usually sold in a 4-year period, so about 1 million bug zappers a year are sold, operating for 40 nights, could destroy 71 billion non-target insects every year. Now, if they actually work to kill mosquitoes, that's great, but they're not. So do what you can to protect the bug population and don't use bug zappers in your own landscape. So bug zappers reduce insect populations, yes, but they're reducing our good guys. So this one is busted, and I would recommend that you don't use them and look at other ways to make your backyard life a little bit more comfortable during mosquito season. All right, let's move on to pruning paint. I can't not put one in that because I'm a tree geek. Let's talk about pruning paint. And this one, this myth, it seems like it refuses to die. It was actually busted so long ago, like almost 40 years ago, this myth was busted. But we'll go through it because pruning paint, if you go to any garden center or box store, I'll say, a box store or hardware store, you are likely to find this pruning paint still on the shelf. And I still get questions every year of, should we do anything to protect the wound from pruning cuts? So painting pruning wounds has been around for actually a really long time. And it's actually interesting because this was researched even back in the 1930s. So it has been around for a very long time, very popular in our culture. And the basis for using pruning paint is a clean, easy, simple way to aid in healing cuts and protecting tree wounds. Because what we do is we cut a branch from a tree and we see this newly cut, naked wound, and we want to do something. We intrinsically want to help that tree. And so we think by covering it or painting over it, that it's somehow going to protect that wound more. Another tout for this is to ensure your trees and vines against decay, insects, and fungi in any kind of weather. So in wet climates, people have recommended using this because you don't want that wound to stay damp, at least that was the thought. So there's a lot of reasons why pruning paint has been recommended and a lot of reasons why we don't recommend it anymore. So pruning wounds, the dressings and painting over them do not prevent the entrance of decay organisms, and they do not stop any sort of rot. Okay, so if you make a bad pruning cut, maybe you don't get quite within the branch collar, the branch bark ridge, and maybe you make something that looks more like a flush cut, and you decide to paint it because you think that will help, it's actually not going to help. So these dressings, no matter how good the cut is not going to prevent decay or rot. What they do is they can seal in moisture and decay because a lot of these products are petroleum based. So it's like an oil that you're putting on. And so if that wound has any sort of decay organisms living on there, or maybe it's wet when you apply the pruning paint, it can actually seal in some of those components. It can serve as a food source for pathogens, never a good thing. And the bigger issue is that these pruning paints may actually prevent the wound from sealing over properly. And so when we have a pruning cut happen, if we do it properly, the tree is compartmentalizing that wound. And so basically what the tree does is it's a signal. We have a pruning cut and the tree is signaled to then form over the callus tissue, which you can see here, this kind of like really thick swollen area in the picture. And so the tree is naturally going to seal off those wounds. That is what the tree does. That's what compartmentalization is. And so Alex Shigo actually debunked this, and he wrote a paper on it of all the research that had been done to that point, but he debunked this back in 1983. 1983, he debunked this, but we still have these products on the market, which is unfortunate. Just know they're not recommended and you don't need to use them. So I mentioned that they're petroleum-based. Essentially, petroleum, because it's an oil-based product, is going to smother the wound, and the wound needs oxygen in order to form that callus tissue. That's what kind of triggers that from happening. So it's a big, complex physiological process, but just know that if you smother it or seal it over with something, the tree isn't able to compartmentalize and seal off that tissue properly. So this is actually a perfectly sealed off wound. This is what it should look like, because trees don't heal. So if we get a cut on our hand, our skin cells just kind of knit back together. But in the case of trees, they actually have to seal off those wounds, and they do that by forming the callus tissue. So as you're walking through your neighborhood and you see pruning cuts, look to see if there's callus tissue or not. Depending on how it was made, you can see up here how it's not the best cut because it's a little bit more thin, but in this case, it's still a good sealing wound. So just keep that in mind. But what can you do with pruning wounds? Well, the first thing, make good pruning cuts. That is number one. So use the 3-cut method. It's pretty easy. The first cut on any large branch or any branch that you're trying to remove, if there's a potential to tear the bark, you'll make that first cut underneath the branch about 8 to 10 inches out. Your second cut will be outside further along the branch. And essentially what cut number 1 does, when you're starting cut number 2 down through the branch, it acts like a hinge. And so it takes the weight off, the branch weight pulls, and then that cut number 1 acts as a hinge, and in good times, the branch usually just snaps right off. So all the weight of the branch is removed. And then your third cut is going to be right outside the branch bark ridge and the branch collar. So identify those. There's lots and lots of good publications. Amy or Tony can throw it in the chat of what it looks like, what to identify. And then of course, prune at the appropriate time of year. We're getting into pruning season. If you miss this window, no big deal. Wait till midsummer after the leaves have hardened off. Keep your tools nice and sharp. And then for any big jobs, or if it's over 6 feet off the ground, that's when you hire a professional. Cannot emphasize that enough. You don't want to be holding a chainsaw or any sort of pruning object over your head on an unsteady surface. Not a good idea. Professionals are worth the investment. So this myth, as you know, is busted. And I just wanted to point out that on this can, I'm not calling out this company at all, but it says caution flammable. I don't think that's a good thing for our trees. Just keep that in mind. Right, the next myth is that plants can repel mosquitoes. So we're focused back on mosquitoes because they are a nuisance when we are trying to work outside, and some people are more attractive to mosquitoes than others. So the myth is that by planting certain plant species in your landscape, these plants will naturally repel mosquitoes and other nuisance insects. These plants sometimes have really fragrant odors. They're sometimes marketed as mosquito plants or will repel mosquitoes. And so you may have seen these during your shopping or your catalog surfing. Do plants really repel mosquitoes? No, they don't. Not the actual plant, not having the plant in your landscape. Now, plants do have components in them, and if you are able to extract those components, yes, some of those can actually be used as insect repellent. But the actual plant, the perennial, the shrub, the tree, that itself is not repelling mosquitoes in any way, shape, or form. It's the volatile oils in the plant that you have to somehow burn or harvest or somehow get out of the plant that can actually do some repellent properties. There is one known as the mosquito plant, and this is a scented geranium, so Pelargonium citrosum. There's a couple different varieties, but it's most commonly sold as the mosquito plant. And it's okay if you plant this in your landscape, absolutely. It's somewhat attractive. The leaves have kind of a, when you rub them, have a lemony smell, and it's like the scented geranium. So thicker leaves, some smell like orange, some smell like lemon, some smell like citronella. But just know that this plant itself, by just planting it, is not going to help repel mosquitoes. And it doesn't contain citronella. So even though it smells like citronella, it doesn't actually contain the essential oil citronella, which comes from a totally different plant that we'll meet next. And citronella, the verdict is still on the table of whether or not it's an effective mosquito repellent. Some studies say yes, other studies say no. But by buying the mosquito plant or a scented geranium and putting it on your table while you have supper outside, this is not going to actually keep mosquitoes away. But you can rub it and enjoy the smell. Citronella, the real citronella, is actually a type of grass. This is not lemongrass. Sometimes they're commonly confused. So again, this is not a lemongrass, but it's its own species. It's an annual, so it's not something that we can grow year-round in our gardens. Zone 10 is like the southernmost part of the United States, and it needs a very, very mild season in order to overwinter. And citronella, the actual oils, can only be obtained through an extraction process. So you actually need to do some sort of fancy extraction process, probably not with equipment that you have around the house, in order to get the citronella out of the plant itself, to extract those volatile oils. And what's really interesting is that studies are still mixed on whether or not citronella works to repel mosquitoes. There are some studies that say, yes, absolutely, 100% works. There's other studies that say, no, it didn't really work that well. And another interesting fact is the European Union has actually banned the use of citronella as an insecticide. Why they did that, I didn't go into details, but just know that it could be related to properties where it's not as effective as it's once touted, or how we once thought it was incredibly effective. So just know that true citronella, in order to get those oils, you have to extract them, and it's not a type of scented geranium. What you can do around the house to repel mosquitoes is to eliminate any sort of standing water or refresh it daily. So if you are feeding the birds or have bird baths or attracting butterflies, things like that, make sure that you're dumping those sources of water, because that's where mosquitoes breed, is in puddles of water. If you have a rain barrel, make sure that you are using that water within a few days. That is the recommendation there, because the mosquito life cycle can happen fairly quickly. It's probably not the best environment in a rain barrel, but it could happen. And if you personally want to repel mosquitoes, something with DEET is going to be the most effective. I kept citronella up there as an example because, again, there are studies that do indicate that it is effective. If you have a pond that doesn't have a pump or where the water isn't circulating, you can actually use some of the biological or chemical controls like mosquito dunks. It's a form of BT that will disrupt the life cycle of the mosquito. But again, making sure you're dumping water sources in your yard. That's going to be number one. And as we know, many of our communities are trying to help also control mosquito populations where they do fogging and other things as well. This was an interesting study from the University of Washington, though, is that researchers recently, this was actually just in my feed a couple days ago, researchers tested if mosquitoes are actually attracted to different colors in addition to CO2. So the reason why mosquitoes are attracted to us is that they can sense our CO2. So every time we breathe in oxygen. When we breathe out, we're expelling CO2. Our skin actually expels CO2, so it's very interesting. So that's why we're a magnet for mosquitoes. And some people have larger amounts of CO2 than others. So if you're a mosquito magnet, that could be a reason. What was really cool though is that those researchers looked at colors. So they had these colored dots and they either spritzed them with CO2 or they left them. And the colored dots that had red, orange, black, or cyan that were spritzed with CO2 were the most desirable to mosquitoes. The other colors, green, blue, white, or purple, even when they were spritzed with CO2, were not as desirable. And the thought is that our skin tone, a lot of our skin tone, regardless, gives off a lot of red and orange hues. And so that could be linked to why the mosquitoes were attracted to the red and orange circles. I don't know. I thought it was a cool study, but if you want to try it out, maybe you wear a white shirt and your friend could wear a red shirt to a barbecue and you can see who gets chewed up the most. I don't know, just an idea. But it was a cool study and some very interesting information coming out on that. So do plants repel mosquitoes? They don't, unfortunately. Again, there are components that you can extract from plants that can repel mosquitoes, but not the plants themselves. So let's talk about lumpy lawns, because I do get this question quite a bit of people who are mowing their lawn or trying to have a good game of soccer, and there's just all these bumps and ruts, and it makes it difficult to have any sort of enjoyable activity on the lawn. Obviously, this picture is an extreme example. The basis of the myth is that it's a concern to homeowners, and I have been on some lawns where you could absolutely twist an ankle trying to walk across it. Sometimes it's the prep of the lawn, sometimes it's the age of the lawn. You know, there's a lot of different factors, but there is one main factor as to why this does occur. But it can be absolutely a safety issue. It's an uneven surface, so making play or lying down not very enjoyable. And there is just a common demand that our lawns be flat and smooth, right? That's fair. And people often think that the lumps are caused by insects or maybe disease or other things like that, when for the most part, it's because of these guys. They're night crawlers, and that's usually what causes our lumpy lawns. So night crawlers, fun fact about them, they're actually an invasive species. They were not here in the United States prior to European settlement. We had worms, okay? We have earthworms like red wigglers and stuff like that, but we did not have night crawlers, the European night crawler, until settlers came into America. So European settlers, when they sailed across the ocean, they filled the ballast of the boat with soil from European countries. And they did this in order to weigh down the boat because, you know, sailing across the ocean, not very fun. You want to make sure that you have a pretty steady base. And so they filled the ballast with a whole bunch of soil in order to have a smoother ride and make sure that it was a safer ride. When they got to America, they dumped all of that soil. They shoveled it out. Poor guys had to shovel it out. And in the soil, they had European night crawlers. Well, the night crawlers took up populations. They loved America. They have invaded all of our states, and they have also become an invasive species in some parts of the country. So the problem with night crawlers is that it's actually a good thing, but yet it's detrimental. So they're very good at doing their job. They're amazing recyclers, and they're really clean animals. They're kind of fascinating, actually, as an arthropod. What they do is night crawlers are so good and so effective at recycling organic material is that they often eat everything. So in a turf system, they can eat all of your thatch, which is amazing, right? Because we talk about having too much thatch can lead to other turf problems. They also can eat your grass, but they do too good of a job and sometimes eat too much, and then you start to see bare spots and things like that. Also, what night crawlers do is that when they poo, they're going to poo, and because they're very clean animals, they actually push that poo out of their burrows, out of the holes, and then onto top of the soil surface. And so you will see this, the earthworm castings on the soil surface. So here's a close-up example. If you're a golfer, this will drive you crazy because you'll never have a straight putt. I can attest to this. So worm deposits, the castings, are their poo from their tunnels that then can come up. And you might see this on a daily basis, absolutely. Or overnight, you'll have a putting surface with all these earthworm castings. So when you have too many worms, they can eat so much that you really don't have a turf system. And we see this often in older lawns, maybe shady lawns, maybe lawns that are a little bit overwatered. And heavy populations of worms also means that you're going to get some of this killing, which comes from the poo, and general lumpiness, because time after time, as these deposits are on top of the soil surface, they're going to become an established part of that. So that's where you get the unevenness, is from the worm castings. So why do worms like lawns? Well, it's a pretty good environment. It's kind of a, it's a good place to live because there's moisture, it's shady and cool below the soil surface. They don't mind clay. They don't mind periods of extreme drought. Actually, night crawlers can go into a dormancy where they basically curl themselves into these tiny little balls where they can prevent themselves from drying out for months until water resumes. There's good organic matter in soils. There's grass clippings, there's tree leaves, there's a lot of different reasons. And really, for the most part, it's an area that's being researched, so we don't know exactly why worms like it. Plus, worms don't care if you apply fertilizer. They don't care if you apply any sort of herbicides. They are incredibly tolerant, if not 100% tolerant, of a lot of those factors. And so it's a pretty good environment for them in general, a lot of benefits. But really, they're too good at recycling. And so in Minnesota, where I'm from, when we go fishing, we would buy our little cup of worms. And then when we didn't use them all at the end of the day, we might toss them into the woods or toss them somewhere near the lake. And what has happened is that those night crawlers have essentially eaten all of the duff layer in our native forests. And so there's no duff. There's a lot more chance for things to go wrong. And so Minnesota has actually deemed them a noxious species. So if you go to Minnesota and fish, do not throw your worms into native areas because it's a bad thing. And golf course superintendents they want to pull their hair out because of some of the issues they have with this. The other thing is that there are no labeled controls for dealing with worms. There's no herbicides, there's no pesticides, there's nothing that you can do or that's readily available. And so it does make it difficult. So what can you do? You could try power raking. That's obviously going to cut up the soil surface, and you might get some very temporary relief doing that. Power raking can be really detrimental to the lawn, so it needs to be timed correctly. And again, it is not a long-term solution. The other thing you can try is rolling your lawn. You can actually rent rollers from companies, and you fill the drum with water, and then you'll actually soak down the water and then roll it. So essentially what you're doing is compacting the soil, right? Which is everything we tell you not to do. But this is a way to do it. Again, a very temporary fix. If you're going to have a wedding or an event on your lawn, maybe rolling the lawn makes sense, but it's not something that you're going to do on a regular basis. So really, for the most part with worms, is you just kind of have to learn to live with them and do the steps to reseeding and trying to keep up with the recycling activity that they're doing with your lawn itself. So are lumpy lawns bad? Yeah, this one actually could be bad because it does cause us some consternation and pain, and worms can absolutely be a nuisance, but they're also very positive. So I'll let you make the decision about lumpy lawns and worms. All right, let's move into companion planting. So companion planting is a really hot topic. And for those of you who are doing vegetable gardens, I am sure that you've heard of the Three Sisters, which is what's featured here. So we have our squash, our beans, and our corn. And the idea is that the corn grows tall. It gives a little bit of shade to the squash. It also gives a place for the beans to grow up. The beans provide nitrogen because they fix nitrogen and they provide some fertilization that way. And you have 3 different crops that can benefit. So companion planting, hot topic, really hard to research. So that's the first thing. The basis of the myth is that certain plants, when planted next to each other, might repel more disease and insects if they're buddies. So if they're best friends, like basil and tomato, not only do they taste good together, but they grow happily together as well. There's also thoughts that some plants might encourage nutrient uptake or additional pollination. And some plants just like each other more, kind of like people. We like certain people more than we like others. So there's this idea with plants that we are actually humanizing them, and the cabbage doesn't prefer to grow by the poor cauliflower. They're not friends. It's too bad. So common companion plants that you might run into, depending on the literature you read, this is from the Farmer's Almanac, that basil will improve the flavor of tomatoes and lettuce. It also helps repel mosquitoes, which all of you know now that the plant basil cannot do that. Marigolds are good companion plants for repelling Mexican bean beetles. Dill improves the flavor and growth of plants in the cabbage family. And dill, poor dill, once you have dill, you'll always have dill. So if that's a choice you decide to make, just know that you'll deal with the consequences of dill for forever. So is there any truth to this? So companion planting as a science-based practice has not been proven. And really, I think where researchers struggle is that it's just too common and vague of a phrase, companion plant. Like, what does that mean? So it's not a very useful definition. And so it hasn't been scientifically proven, but there is, I think, some validity in this, and there's a little bit of truth. So there are documented benefits out there for sure. We just can't say as a whole that yes, companion planting works, but aspects of companion planting are totally legit. And some of the associations that we're making with companion plants might be the physical, chemical, or biological alterations that the plant actually does to improve its own establishment in surviving in the garden. Okay, so it's its own adaptation that the plant has done. Okay, so alleliopathy is one of these things that plants have developed or plants that do. And this is a science, and this has been proven. So the literal definition of alleliopathy is death to others. So hopefully you are not alleliopathic in your life. That's not a good thing, but it can happen with some plants. And what happens is that the plants may have either beneficial or they can have potentially harmful effects on another plant near them, a crop, a specific group of plants, because of the allelochemicals that the plant releases either through leaves or through the roots or through exudation. There's a lot of different ways that alleliopathy can occur. So it is a really interesting science. I would say that it's not new, but it's being researched a little bit more. So the one that you might be most familiar with is black walnuts and how they're alleliopathic to tomatoes. And I put it as a question mark because science is hard. It's really, really hard to get good concrete data that can be replicated by other people. But black walnuts, if you can find one, we don't have many left here on the Front Range, their entire plant system has a chemical called juglone that's in the leaves, the fruit, the roots, and it can also be released into the soil. So even having leaves of black walnut fall to the ground and break down can release juglone. And the thought is that it will kill your tomatoes or really anything in the solanaceous family that are planted nearby. Anything that might come in contact with the tree's roots or any part of the plant can kill your plants. Oops. So in the 1920s, this one goes way back, there was noticed damage to tomatoes and other crops that were planted near walnut trees, and people started making this association. It actually was suggested by a Virginia gardener, just suggested, not proven, but hey, this gardener said, oh, maybe it's the black walnut that's causing the death on our crops. So it was suggested. And there's been a lot of observational evidence. You may have indeed seen this in your garden if you have black walnuts where you can't grow tomatoes or maybe other crops. And so I think there is an association, but pinpointing that in a setting with so many different compounding factors has been nearly impossible to actually detect. So I think there is something to it. It's just really, really hard to say. So it's okay if we say there's an association with juglone and tomatoes or black walnut and tomatoes. I think that's fair to say. But there are other plants that actually have a proven alleliopathy. One that I have run into is crested wheatgrass. This is one of the natives that are planted in our open space areas. And for the most part, a lot of crested wheatgrass is a complete stand. You don't see weeds, you don't see other grasses. There is something there. I don't know if it's actually been proven, but that's kind of a cool thing that if you're looking for a complete stand, a monoculture of a larger grass for an open space area, crested wheat might fit that bill. So there is that. So alleliopathy has not yet been confirmed to every researcher's or scientist's satisfaction. Okay, so there have been studies where, yes, it's been proven, but then the next guy comes along, I don't really like that. The next guy comes along, no, I found fault with this part of it. And so it's there, it's just really, really hard to determine. So that's what's cool about science, is that I could give this talk in 2 years and things would change, but it is a head scratcher. So I think there is, to whether or not to bust this myth, is that there is some plausibility that companion planting does exist. Okay, we'll leave it at that. And then my last one before we take questions or wrap it up for the day is to talk about vinegar as organic weed control. So this might be something that you have tried or read online, where you can go to the grocery store, you can buy some table vinegar and apply it to weeds. So let's talk about that, if this makes sense and if this is something that you should consider for your own garden. So the reason for this myth is that it's cheap and easy to use. Great. It's an earth-friendly alternative to modern chemistry. Totally fine. We're all looking for ways that we can be a little bit more sustainable. And using vinegar is safe around kids and pets. We're always concerned about our four-legged and two-legged friends and making sure that we're applying products to our weeds that are safe. So the idea for vinegar is that you would buy table vinegar, which is acetic acid, and it's at a 5% level. So there's a lot of different things out there about using table vinegar. And so this is what the science tells us about using vinegar as weed control. This was done at Cornell over in New York. And what they found is that a single application of acetic acid, so essentially taking whatever comes in the bottle, the table vinegar, and dumping it on the plant or spraying it on the plant, is ineffective short term. Okay, that's a single application. So if you really want to go after weeds, you're going to need to do multiple applications. So the plant might burn down a little bit, it's going to come back, you spray it again, it's going to come back, you spray it again, and this could go on all summer. What else is really important is that the weed will be most easily killed when it's young. So we're talking young annual weeds. Those perennial weeds like dandelions, bindweed, they will just laugh. They will actually giggle as you apply the vinegar to them, the table vinegar. So this might work if you have young weeds, okay, young crabgrass, spurge, things like that. Now, if you go up with your vinegar to horticultural vinegar, which is usually sold as a 20% concentration of acetic acid, the 20% concentration resulted in 100% control of annual weeds when they have emerged within 2 weeks. Okay, so we're talking, again, very, very young weeds, but one application of those young weeds using horticulture vinegar can be effective. On perennial weeds, only 5% showed 100% shoot burn down. So the whole top of it burned down, but the roots were ineffective. So you might get, again, a momentary, victory when you see that dandelion turn brown in your pathway, but just know that the dandelion's roots are going to do everything it can to send up new shoots, and you're still going to have the dandelion. So one application even of horticultural vinegar on perennial weeds is not going to work. So are there alternatives to glyphosate? We're not going to get into a debate about glyphosate or whether or not you want to use this product. This is known as Roundup, but just know that there is a lot of different products out there. I just sat in a talk with Dr. Koski last week at Pruning where he talked about some of these alternatives. And yes, these are available to you on the homeowner market. So these are all contact herbicides. Some of them are certified organic, so you could use that. Like horticultural vinegar is one you could use in an organic situation. And just know that they are available, but they are not systemic. So they are contact only, meaning that they're just going to burn down whatever you apply it to. And his takeaway was that they are going to need multiple applications in order to finally kill the weed. But just know they're out there. You could apply clove oil and sodium lauryl sulfate. Smells delicious. You know, you might like that scent in your garden. You could use caprylic acid. There's horticultural vinegar. There are options out there if you don't want to use glyphosate. So just know, keep an eye out for those in your local garden center. But with these products, and this is where I really, really need to emphasize how careful you need to be, is that horticulture vinegar, caprylic acid, and some of those are not to be messed with. These products can be extremely caustic. They can permanently damage your eyes. They can cause burning to your skin. You really have to wear full PPE. That means long pants, long shirts. A respirator is highly recommended, if not required. This is where the label comes into play. And so just because these products are organic, just because it's not Roundup, it doesn't mean that they're safe. I can't emphasize that enough. And you can actually get even stronger concentrations of acetic acid, like 60% or 70% acetic acid, and it is just taking such a risk. So please, please, please be very careful. You just need to take the ultimate caution. So when you're looking at the label of things, you're going to see 3 words. These are signal words. You'll see caution, warning, or danger. Roundup is caution. You'll read the label as to what you need to do. Danger is the one that you need to take extra caution with. Okay, this is the one, the big one. This is the big one that you need. This is 3 skull and crossbones because it actually scares me. But again, make sure that you are protecting yourself because splashing it it's just that it can be very, very dangerous. So that's my word of caution to you, and make sure that you're reading the label, you're applying it as directed, and that you are keeping yourself safe when you're applying these products as well. So does vinegar kill weeds? Yes, it does. It's just table vinegar is not the product that you want to reach for. You'll need something with a stronger concentration, and then take the cautionary steps in order to protect yourself when using this product. So yeah, vinegar can kill weeds. Gardening in today's culture, I encourage you when you're doing your searches, you can use Google, you can use Bing, whatever suits your fancy, but follow your search with site:/edu. And so if you have a question on trees for Colorado, or how do I prune my tree, you'll notice that all of the links we've given you today are generally EDU resources. And what this does is it separates some of the .coms and maybe some of the information that isn't as valid to those educational resources. And that's a really important thing. So any search term, follow it with site:/edu, and it will limit just educationally based resources. It will also pull in the State Forest Service, which is also really helpful, and some other things. You can do the same thing with site:/gov if you want to do that. And just a couple of reminders as we wrap up. Remember, this class was recorded. If you had to leave, you're gone. But if you want to rewatch it, we will send you the recorded link. I'll also include the slides for your viewing. And if you want to save the chat, now is the time to do that. Click on those 3 dots, ... and it will save to your downloads folder. So you need to, that's the default for Zoom, is it will save to your downloads folder, and we will not be sending the chat in the recording. So I will end with any questions. I'm totally in stage 7 right now. I might be moving on to stage 8. So it looks cold, at least in the Front Range for the next few weeks. So Amy, what can I answer?
We've covered a lot of stuff in the chat. Let me circle back though on some of these, and we'll just kind of talk about them until some new ones pop up, although maybe one just did. Oh, yes, absolutely, Allie. Ask a question that may not be related to, but now would be a good time for that. So there's been talk of like chives. Do they deter insects? I don't know. Thoughts on that?
So here's the thing is like planting chives, if you think it deters insects, it's not going to hurt anything, right? You can give it a try. If you think you have a beneficial effect, it might be placebo, but hey, that's cool. You get chives out of it. So that's okay. But just know that it might not be scientifically based, and that's okay. I think we often do a lot of things that we do because we think it works, or because, grandma told us it works. And so that's what we do. So.
Yeah. And then there was a little talk about, planting trap crops. And so I did put a link in the chat to an article from Missouri about trap cropping. Just have to be careful that you're not going to plant so many trap crops that you end up inviting additional guests to the dinner table. There was some talk about,
great.
Yeah, there was some talk at the very beginning about when we were talking about the boy and girl eggplants, that there are actually boy and girl trees. Do you want to?
There are.
You want to talk a little bit about that?
All right. Amy, I'm going to defer to you and your botanical genius on that one. But basically, we have monoecious and dioecious plants. So we do have male and female trees. Like there are female ginkgos, which then produce the really delicious, awful smelling fruit that we get. And then the ones now in the trade are males. So they do exist, just not with our bell peppers and our eggplants. Do you want to expand upon that?
No, I mean, that's what I would have said too. And that's what I told them. Kentucky coffee tree, box elder, cottonwoods. There's a bunch of those where
some hollies. There's some hollies that are male
hollies.
And female.
And in hollies, they actually call them China boy and China girl holly. So with the common names, so they actually will tell you boy or girl. So, I mean, is it really a boy plant? I don't know. It's just got male flowers, but it's just a plant. I don't know if it has, the plant doesn't have.
I don't know if we need to gender our plants.
Exactly. Exactly. Now here's a question that is just a side note. I want to bring up Allie's question. Not really a myth, but she broke open a carving pumpkin back in October. She put that she had put in the compost, and she noticed that there were a lot of seeds that had sprouted. And so this goes back to our seed starting class from last week, Allison. Do you think that she can dig those out with the roots intact, put them in some dirt, and have a chance that they'll survive?
Why not try, Allie? I think yeah, they like Tony is in the room with me. He said they need some light. I would agree. If they are still living after this winter, that's a good question. But Allie, please try. Let us know what happens. We'd love to see what kind of pumpkins you might get.
It's a little early on. So usually if you were going to start pumpkins inside, it would be like maybe, I don't know, early May, late April. So you might have a really big pumpkin to put outside when it's time. So keep that in mind of how many of those you want to save. All right, there are some more questions coming in. Anything, let's see, anything to apply toward grasshopper infestation? These are kind of random questions at this point.
Yeah, so grasshoppers, you want to predict that it's going to be a good grasshopper year and put out baits really early when they're little. So there are some baits that you can get. There are some products where it's like, basically like, it's not, but it's like potato chips, and then there's some sort of insecticide on there. There are some other biological controls, but the key for all of that is to get the grasshoppers when they are itty bitty, and probably you won't notice them. If you're seeing grasshoppers in July and August, it's too late for any baits, and you would have to go to like a contact insecticide. So you'd actually have to spray the grasshopper, which is really hard because they're very mobile. So do the baits early. You can get them, you just kind of sprinkle them around the yard. And also we need to hope for a really exposed cold winter that might kill some of the overwintering eggs.
All right. Well, we are over time, and I'm sure there's going to be a couple more questions that come in, but we do want to say thank you all of you for joining. This was such a fun class, Allison. I love this. We need to do this one again with some different myths. There's all kinds of myths out there. I'm sure we can come up with
so many. If you have
more
myths you'd like us to discuss, send those. We'll do it again.
Yeah, fun stuff. All right. Well, thanks everybody. Have a great rest of your day, and hopefully we'll see you in March.